If the camera wasn't recording, we wouldn't believe what this Bernese mountain dog did to save the baby. The footage shows Christina Cruz collapsing to her knees in the hallway, her hands shaking as she stares at the gaping hole where her daughter's ceiling used to be. Chunks of plaster and twisted metal beams fill the crib, where 3-year-old Emma had been sleeping just minutes before. The dog, a massive 120-pound Bernese named Stephen Peterson, stands guard over the toddler in the corner of the room, his body forming a protective barrier between the child and the destruction. Christina's voice breaks as she whispers the words that would haunt her forever. I almost gave him away. I almost gave away the deed who saved my daughter's life. This isn't just another heartwarming pet story. This is about life and death, about a mother who came within hours of making the most devastating mistake of her life, and about an animal whose desperate attempts to communicate danger were dismissed as behavioral problems. What you're about to discover will change how you see every protective gesture, every insistent bark, every moment when your pet refuses to leave your child's side. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. We want to hear your voice too. Share your own incredible pet stories because yours could be the next one featured on our channel. 3 weeks earlier, the Peterson household was the picture of domestic bliss. Christina and her husband, Jerry Ramos, had settled into the rhythm of life with their energetic 3-year-old daughter, Emma. Their Bernese mountain dog, Stephen, had been part of the family since before Emma was born. A gentle giant who had appointed himself as the child's guardian from her first day home from the hospital. The massive dog would lie beside her crib during naps, his deep brown eyes tracking every movement, his presence a constant source of comfort for the growing family. Stephen had always been the perfect family dog. At 4 years old, he was fully trained, patient with Emma's toddler antics, and protective without being aggressive. He would let her climb on his back, pull his ears, and use him as a pillow during afternoon cartoons. Jerry often joked that they had gotten themselves a furry babysitter instead of a pet. Christina would find them curled up together on the living room floor, Emma's tiny hand buried in Stephen's thick coat, both of them peaceful in sleep. The house itself was a modest 2-story suburban home that Jerry and Christina had bought when Emma was 6 months old. They had spent months making it perfect for their growing family, painting the nursery a soft yellow, installing safety gates, and baby-proofing every corner. Emma's room was on the 2nd floor, a cozy space filled with stuffed animals, picture books, and the gentle hum of a white noise machine. The room directly below was Jerry's home office, where he worked remotely as a software engineer. Everything felt secure, planned, and safe. That Tuesday morning in late September started like any other. Christina was getting Emma ready for preschool, while Jerry prepared for a video conference call. Stephen lay in his usual spot by the kitchen island, watching the morning routine with the patient attention that had become his trademark. But something was different. As Christina carried Emma upstairs to brush her teeth, Stephen followed, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how he positioned himself in the doorway of Emma's room, his massive frame blocking the entrance. Christina didn't think much of it at first. Dogs could be quirky, and Stephen had always been protective of Emma's space. But when she tried to lead Emma into her room to get her backpack, Stephen didn't move. He stood firm, his eyes fixed on something inside the room that Christina couldn't identify. When she gently pushed past him, he followed closely, positioning himself between Emma and her bed with an intensity that made Christina pause. The behavior continued throughout the week. Every time Emma entered her room, Stephen would follow and assume what Christina began to think of as his guard position. He would lie across the threshold, his body creating a barrier that made it difficult for Emma to move freely around her own space. At night, instead of sleeping in his usual spot downstairs, Stephen began sleeping directly outside Emma's door, sometimes whining softly in a way that made Christina's chest tighten with unnamed anxiety. Jerry noticed it too. Stephen's behavior was becoming more pronounced, more insistent. The dog would pace the hallway outside Emma's room during the day, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that seemed almost frantic. When Emma played in her room, Stephen would position himself in the doorway and refuse to move, his eyes constantly scanning the ceiling and walls as if he could see something that remained invisible to human perception. Christina tried to rationalize the behavior. Maybe Stephen was going through some kind of phase. Maybe he was responding to stress in the household that she hadn't recognized. She had been working longer hours lately, and Jerry had been traveling more for work. Perhaps Stephen was simply responding to changes in routine by becoming more protective of Emma. But deep down, something about his behavior felt different, more urgent, as if he was trying to communicate something crucial that she couldn't understand. The first real sign of trouble came on a Thursday evening. Christina was reading Emma her bedtime story when Stephen began scratching at the bedroom door from the outside. The scratching wasn't the gentle pawing he sometimes did when he wanted attention. This was desperate, insistent, the sound of claws digging into wood with enough force to leave marks. Christina opened the door to find Stephen pacing in tight circles, his breathing heavy and his eyes wide with what could only be described as panic. She let him into the room thinking his presence might calm him down, but Stephen's behavior only escalated. He positioned himself directly under the area where Emma's crib had been before they transitioned her to a toddler bed, staring up at the ceiling with an intensity that made Christina follow his gaze. She saw nothing unusual. The ceiling looked exactly as it always had, painted white with a small light fixture in the center. But Stephen continued to stare, occasionally whining in a way that made Christina's skin crawl. That night, Stephen refused to leave Emma's room. When Christina tried to lead him out after Emma fell asleep, he planted his feet and would not budge. His massive frame became dead weight, impossible to move without causing a scene that might wake Emma. Christina gave up, leaving Stephen curled up beside Emma's bed, his watchful eyes never leaving the ceiling above them. The behavior continued for days. Stephen would barely eat, spending almost all his time either in Emma's room or pacing the hallway outside it. His usual playful demeanor disappeared, replaced by a vigilance that seemed to consume all his energy. Christina began to notice physical changes in the dog. His paws were scratched and raw from clawing at Emma's door. He had lost weight, his ribs beginning to show through his thick coat. Dark circles appeared around his eyes, the canine equivalent of exhaustion. Jerry's patience began to wear thin first. He had been working from his home office directly below Emma's room, and Stephen's pacing had become a constant distraction. The sound of the dog's nails on the floor above created a rhythmic clicking that made it impossible to concentrate during important calls. Jerry found himself snapping at Stephen, ordering him downstairs with a sharpness that was unlike his usual gentle manner with the dog. Christina felt caught between her husband's growing frustration and her own confusion about Stephen's behavior. She had researched online, reading articles about dogs becoming overprotective of children, about separation anxiety, about behavioral changes that could indicate medical issues. Everything she read suggested that Stephen might be experiencing some kind of psychological stress that was manifesting as obsessive guarding behavior. The recommended solutions all involve creating distance between the dog and the child, reestablishing boundaries, and potentially seeking help from a professional dog trainer. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning, 2.5 weeks into Stephen's strange behavior. Christina had been looking forward to a quiet morning with her family, but Stephen's pacing had started before dawn. The sound of his nails on the hardwood had woken Emma, who began crying for her parents at 5:30 in the morning. When Christina went to comfort her daughter, she found Stephen positioned protectively over Emma's bed, his body language suggesting that he perceived some imminent threat. Jerry appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his eyes hollow from weeks of interrupted sleep. He looked at Stephen with a mixture of exhaustion and anger that Christina had never seen before. "This has to stop," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't work like this. Emma can't sleep like this. We can't live like this." Christina knew he was right. Stephen's behavior had become disruptive to their entire household. Emma was beginning to seem anxious, picking up on the tension that surrounded Stephen's constant vigilance. The toddler would look between her parents and the worry with confusion, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to understand what. Christina had noticed Emma becoming more clingy, more reluctant to play in her own room, as if she too felt the weight of Stephen's inexplicable anxiety. That afternoon, while Emma napped downstairs on the couch, Christina and Jerry had the conversation they had both been avoiding. They sat at their kitchen table, speaking in whispers while Stephen paced the floor above them, and discussed the possibility that they might need to rehome their beloved dog. The words felt impossible to say out loud. Stephen had been part of their family for years. He had been there when Emma took her first steps, had comforted her through teething and nightmares, had been her constant companion and protector. But they couldn't continue living in a state of constant tension. Jerry's work was suffering. Christina was exhausted from mediating between her husband's frustration and Stephen's inexplicable behavior. Emma deserved to feel comfortable and safe in her own home, not caught in the middle of a situation that none of them understood. They agreed to give Stephen one more week, and if his behavior didn't improve, they would start looking for a new home for him. The decision felt like a betrayal, but Christina convinced herself it was the right choice for everyone involved. Maybe Stephen would be happier in a home without children, where he wouldn't feel the need to engage in whatever protective behavior was driving his current obsession. Maybe a family with older children, or no children at all, would be better equipped to handle his needs. She began browsing rehoming websites, her heart breaking with every listing she read. Stephen seemed to sense the shift in household energy. His behavior became even more frantic, more desperate. He began refusing to leave Emma's room even for meals, forcing Christina to bring his food and water bowls upstairs. He would barely eat, taking a few bites before returning his attention to his vigilant watch over Emma's ceiling. His whining became constant, a low sound of distress that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the house. Christina found herself studying Stephen's behavior more closely, trying to understand what he was seeing or sensing that remained invisible to her. She would lie on Emma's bed and stare at the same spot on the ceiling that seemed to captivate Stephen's attention, looking for cracks, stains, or any sign of structural issue. She saw nothing. The ceiling appeared solid and unchanged, but Stephen's focus never wavered. Jerry's frustration reached a boiling point on Wednesday evening. He had been on an important video call with potential clients when Stephen's pacing became so loud that the people on the other end of the call began asking about the noise. Jerry had to excuse himself, ending the call early and potentially losing a significant contract. He stormed upstairs to find Stephen in his usual position, guarding Emma's room with an intensity that seemed almost manic. "Move," Jerry commanded, grabbing Stephen by the collar and pulling him away from Emma's doorway. The dog resisted, his claws scrambling for purchase on the hardwood floor as Jerry dragged him toward the stairs. Stephen's whining became a howl of distress, a sound so heartbreaking that Emma woke up crying. Christina rushed upstairs to find Jerry red-faced with anger and Stephen cowering at the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on Emma's room as if he could will himself back to his post through sheer determination. That night, Jerry and Christina made the final decision. They would start actively looking for a new home for Stephen within the next few days. Christina called her sister, who had connections in animal rescue, and began the painful process of creating a profile for Stephen that highlighted his gentle nature with children while carefully omitting the recent behavioral issues that had made him impossible to live with. The next morning, Christina woke to an unusual sound. Instead of Stephen's familiar pacing, she heard a different kind of scratching, more intense and focused than his usual door clawing. She found him in Emma's room, his front paws elevated against the wall directly below the spot on the ceiling where his attention had been focused for weeks. He was scratching at the wall with a desperation that had torn strips of wallpaper and left gouges in the drywall beneath. Christina's first instinct was anger. Stephen had never been destructive before, and the damage to Emma's room felt like the final straw. But something about his behavior stopped her from scolding him immediately. This wasn't random destruction. Stephen was scratching at one specific spot, his movements precise and purposeful. He would scratch, then step back and stare at the area, then return to scratching with renewed intensity. For the first time in weeks, Christina found herself really looking at the spot that had captured Stephen's attention. She got down on her hands and knees, examining the wall where Stephen had been scratching. At first glance, it looked like normal wear and tear from the dog's claws. But as she looked more closely, she began to notice something else. There were small holes in the drywall, tiny punctures that looked almost like bite marks. And around those holes, the faintest trace of what looked like a dark stain. Christina's heart began to race. She called Jerry upstairs, and together they examined the wall more closely. The holes were definitely not caused by Stephen's claws. They were too small, too precise, and they seemed to go deeper into the wall than surface scratches should reach. Jerry got a flashlight and shone it into one of the larger holes. What he saw made him step back with a sharp intake of breath. There was movement inside the wall, something dark and segmented, something that definitely didn't belong in the structure of their home. Jerry immediately called a pest control company explaining that they had discovered what appeared to be some kind of infestation in their daughter's bedroom wall. The company promised to send someone out within the hour, treating the situation as an emergency given the proximity to a child's sleeping area. While they waited for the pest control expert to arrive, Christina and Jerry kept Emma downstairs, away from her room. Stephen, meanwhile, had positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, his body blocking access to the second floor with the same protective intensity he had shown for weeks. For the first time since his behavior had started, Christina found herself grateful for his vigilance rather than frustrated by it. The pest control expert, a middle-aged man named Lewis Stewart, arrived with equipment that looked more suited for a hazardous materials situation than a routine house call. He took one look at the holes in Emma's wall and immediately asked Christina and Jerry to evacuate the room while he conducted his inspection. His serious demeanor and the protective gear he donned before entering Emma's room made Christina's stomach clench with retroactive fear. Lewis emerged from Emma's room 20 minutes later, his face grim behind his protective mask. He asked Christina and Jerry to sit down before he explained what he had found. Inside the wall of Emma's room, he had discovered an extensive nest of giant centipedes, some measuring over 6 inches in length. The creatures were venomous, capable of delivering bites that could be potentially fatal to a small child. They had been living in the wall for weeks, possibly months, emerging at night to hunt for food. The dark stains Christina had noticed around the holes were not water damage or mold. They were the remnants of centipede venom, evidence that the creatures had been actively feeding and potentially attempting to establish hunting territory in Emma's room. Lewis explained that giant centipedes were attracted to warmth and the carbon dioxide that sleeping humans exhale. Emma's room, with its consistent temperature and the presence of a sleeping child, would have been an ideal hunting ground for the creatures. Most terrifying of all, Lewis found evidence that the centipedes had been emerging from the wall on a regular basis. He discovered shed exoskeletons under Emma's bed and traces of venom on her sheets and stuffed animals. Emma had been sharing her room with potentially deadly creatures for weeks, and the only thing standing between her and serious harm had been Stephen's constant vigilance. Lewis explained that dogs have an extraordinary ability to detect chemical signatures that are invisible to humans. Stephen had been smelling the centipede's pheromones and venom from the very beginning, recognizing them as a threat to Emma long before any human could have detected their presence. His positioning in Emma's doorway, his refusal to let her sleep alone in the room, his constant staring at the ceiling had all been attempts to protect her from a danger that he could sense but couldn't communicate in words. The scratching at the wall had been Stephen's final, desperate attempt to expose the threat. He had been trying to break through the drywall to reveal the nest, to force his human family to see what he had been trying to tell them for weeks. His behavior hadn't been obsessive or problematic. It had been heroic. Christina felt her knees give way as the full implications of Lewis's explanation sank in. She had been planning to give away the boy who had been saving her daughter's life every single night. Stephen's sleepless vigilance, his refusal to leave Emma alone, his increasingly frantic behavior had all been driven by his knowledge that deadly creatures were hunting in his little girl's room. Every time Christina and Jerry had forced him away from Emma's door, they had been removing the only barrier between their daughter and potentially fatal danger. Jerry sat heavily in one of Emma's small chairs, his face pale with shock and guilt. He calculated the nights when he had physically dragged Stephen away from Emma's room, the times he had scolded the dog for his protective positioning, the moments when Stephen's whining had kept them awake and they had responded with anger instead of gratitude. The weight of what could have happened pressed down on both parents like a physical force. Lewis continued his explanation, detailing the treatment process that would be necessary to eliminate the centipede infestation. The room would need to be sealed off and treated with specialized chemicals. Emma would not be able to sleep in her room for at least a week while the treatment took effect and the area was thoroughly cleaned. The wall where Stephen had been scratching would need to be torn out and rebuilt to ensure that no trace of the nest remained. As Lewis worked to seal off Emma's room and begin the treatment process, Christina found Stephen lying in the hallway, his exhausted body finally at rest now that the threat had been identified and addressed. She knelt beside him, running her hands through his thick coat, feeling the weight of his sacrifice in every scratched paw and every hollow rib. He had given everything to protect Emma, wearing himself down to nothing in his desperate attempts to communicate a danger that his human family had dismissed as behavioral problems. Christina buried her face in Stephen's fur, her voice breaking as she whispered apologies that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. She thought about the rehoming websites she had browsed, the phone calls she had made to animal rescue organizations, the conversations she and Jerry had had about finding Stephen a new home. They had been planning to abandon the hero who had been saving their daughter's life. Jerry joined them in the hallway, his own voice thick with emotion as he added his apologies to Christina's. They sat together on the floor, their arms around Stephen, finally understanding that his behavior had never been about jealousy or anxiety or behavioral problems. It had been about love, the kind of love that doesn't sleep when danger is near, that doesn't give up when its warnings are dismissed, that continues to protect even when protection is met with frustration and anger. That evening, with Emma safely settled in the guest room downstairs and Stephen finally able to rest, Christina and Jerry sat in their kitchen and tried to process what had happened. The pest control treatment was underway upstairs, the sound of industrial equipment a reminder of how close they had come to an unthinkable tragedy. Emma had been sleeping directly above a nest of venomous creatures for weeks, and the only thing that had kept her safe was a being whose desperate warnings they had almost ignored completely. Christina thought about the nights when Stephen's whining had woken them up, the mornings when they had found him positioned protectively over Emma's bed, the countless times he had refused to leave her room despite their growing frustration. Every single one of those moments had been Stephen detecting the presence of creatures that could have killed Emma with a single bite. His behavior hadn't been disruptive. It had been life-saving. Jerry pulled up articles on his laptop about giant centipedes, reading aloud the descriptions of their venom and the effects of their bites on small children. The creatures were aggressive hunters, capable of delivering enough venom to cause severe tissue damage, respiratory distress, and in some cases, death. Children Emma's age were particularly vulnerable due to their small body mass and developing immune systems. The articles confirmed what Lewis had told them. Without Stephen's protection, Emma could have faced serious harm or worse. The next morning brought a parade of professionals to their home. The pest control team returned to continue treatment and assess the extent of the infestation. A structural engineer arrived to examine the wall where the nest had been located, checking for damage that might have allowed the creatures access to the interior of the house. A contractor came to provide estimates for rebuilding Emma's room once the pest treatment was complete. Each professional who examined the situation confirmed the same thing. Stephen's behavior had been a textbook example of a dog detecting and responding to a serious threat. The structural engineer explained that dogs could detect minute changes in air pressure and chemical composition that indicated the presence of pests or structural problems. The pest control expert shared stories of other cases where family pets had tried to warn their owners about hidden infestations, though he admitted that Stephen's persistence and accuracy were exceptional. Christina found herself watching Stephen with new eyes. The dog who had seemed obsessive and problematic just days before now appeared as what he truly was, a hero who had sacrificed his own comfort and well-being to protect the most vulnerable member of his family. His scratched paws were evidence of his determination. His weight loss showed the physical toll of his constant vigilance. His exhaustion was the price he had paid for Emma's safety. Emma, meanwhile, seemed to understand on some instinctual level that Stephen had been protecting her. When Christina explained in simple terms that Stephen had been keeping her safe from bad bugs in her room, Emma wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck and whispered thank you in his ear. Stephen's tail wagged for the first time in weeks, a gentle movement that spoke of relief and recognition. The rehabilitation of Emma's room took 10 days. During that time, the family lived in a state of heightened awareness and gratitude. Christina and Jerry found themselves paying attention to Stephen's behavior in ways they never had before, looking for signs and signals they might have missed. They realized that Stephen had always been an excellent judge of character in situations, but they had dismissed his instincts as mere pet behavior rather than recognizing them as valuable intelligence. When Emma's room was finally declared safe and ready for occupancy, Stephen was the first to inspect it. He walked through the space carefully, his nose working to detect any remaining traces of the threat that had consumed his attention for so many weeks. Satisfied that the danger had been eliminated, he settled into his old spot beside Emma's bed, finally able to rest peacefully, knowing that his vigilance had succeeded. The local news picked up the story, interviewing Christina and Jerry about Stephen's heroic behavior and the importance of paying attention to changes in pet behavior. The story resonated with viewers who shared their own experiences of pets detecting dangers that humans had missed. Christina received dozens of messages from other parents who described similar situations where their family dogs had tried to warn them about hidden threats. The veterinarian who had been treating Stephen throughout his ordeal, a compassionate woman named Sandra Myers, explained to Christina and Jerry that Stephen's behavior was actually quite common among dogs who detect threats to their family members. She described the acute sensory capabilities that allow dogs to perceive dangers that remain invisible to human senses. And she praised Stephen's persistence in maintaining his protective behavior, despite the negative responses he had received from his human family. Sandra explained that dogs like Stephen often experience significant stress when they detect threats that their humans cannot perceive. The constant vigilance, the inability to communicate the specific nature of the danger, and the frustration of having their warnings dismissed can take a serious physical and emotional toll on protective dogs. Stephen's weight loss and exhaustion were typical responses to the kind of prolonged stress he had experienced while trying to keep Emma safe. The revelation about Stephen's heroism fundamentally changed the dynamics in the Peterson household. Christina and Jerry began paying attention to Stephen's behavior in ways they never had before, recognizing that his instincts and senses provided valuable information about their family's safety and well-being. They learned to read his body language more carefully, to notice when his attention was drawn to specific areas or situations, and to investigate rather than dismiss his concerns. Emma, now sleeping safely in her renovated room, seemed to understand that Stephen was her special protector. She began including him in her bedtime routine, reading him stories and sharing her stuffed animals with him. The bond between the little girl and the jag deepened into something that went beyond typical pet-owner relationships. They had shared an experience that neither could fully articulate, but both seemed to understand on a fundamental level. Christina found herself thinking often about the phone calls she had made to animal rescue organizations, the conversations she and Jerry had had about rehoming Stephen, and how close they had come to making an irreversible mistake. The guilt was overwhelming at times, but it was tempered by profound gratitude for Stephen's unwavering loyalty and protection. Even when his human family had failed to understand his warnings, even when they had responded to his heroism with frustration and anger, Stephen had never stopped protecting Emma. The story of Stephen's heroism spread throughout their community and beyond. Neighbors stopped by to meet the dog who had saved Emma's life, and local pet stores began carrying information about recognizing protective behavior in family dogs. Christina and Jerry found themselves becoming advocates for paying attention to changes in pet behavior, sharing their story at community events, and encouraging other pet owners to investigate rather than dismiss unusual behavior from their animals. Jerry's relationship with Stephen transformed completely. The man who had been frustrated by the dog's pacing and whining became Stephen's biggest champion, bragging to anyone who would listen about the dog's intelligence and protective instincts. Jerry began taking Stephen on longer walks, spending more time training and bonding with him, and treating him with the respect due to a family member who had literally saved a life. The pest control expert, Lewis Stewart, stayed in touch with the family, checking periodically to ensure that the centipede problem had been completely resolved. He used their case as an example in his training materials, teaching other pest control professionals to pay attention to pet behavior as an early warning system for infestations. Lewis often said that Stephen had been more effective at detecting and locating the centipede nest than any of his professional equipment. Christina began volunteering with local animal rescue organizations, sharing Stephen's story and advocating for dogs whose protective behavior had been misunderstood by their families. She met other families who had faced similar situations, and she worked to educate pet owners about the importance of investigating changes in animal behavior rather than automatically assuming behavioral problems. The experience changed how Christina and Jerry approached parenting as well. They became more attentive to subtle signals and warnings, more willing to investigate situations that seemed unusual or concerning. Stephen had taught them that protection often comes in forms that aren't immediately recognizable, and that dismissing warnings because they don't fit our expectations can have serious consequences. Emma's third birthday party, held 2 months after the centipede incident, became a celebration not just of her life, but of Stephen's heroism. The guest list included Lewis Stewart, Sandra Myers, and several neighbors who had followed the story. Stephen wore a special collar with a medal that Christina and Jerry had commissioned, engraved with the words, "Emma's Guardian Angel." The dog seemed to understand the significance of the celebration, accepting praise and attention with the dignity of a hero who had simply done what needed to be done. The local fire department presented Stephen with an honorary certificate recognizing his life-saving actions. Fire Chief William Hill explained that Stephen's behavior was exactly what emergency responders hoped to see from family pets: persistent, protective, and focused on keeping family members safe from harm. The certificate joined Stephen's medal as permanent reminders of his heroic actions. As the months passed, Christina and Jerry noticed that their relationship with Stephen had evolved into something deeper than typical pet ownership. They had learned to trust his instincts in ways that went beyond the centipede incident. When Stephen showed reluctance to enter certain areas of their property, they investigated and often found legitimate safety concerns. When he seemed agitated around certain people, they paid attention and often discovered that their own instincts aligned with his assessment. Emma continued to thrive in her renovated room, but her relationship with Stephen remained special. She would often be found reading to him, sharing her snacks with him, and including him in her imaginative play. To Emma, Stephen wasn't just a pet. He was the guardian who had kept her safe from monsters she couldn't see. Their bond represented something pure and trusting that touched everyone who witnessed it. The story attracted attention from animal behaviorists and researchers who were studying the ability of dogs to detect threats and communicate warnings to their human families. Stephen became part of a research study examining the sensory capabilities of domestic dogs and their role as early warning systems for various dangers. The research confirmed what Christina and Jerry had learned firsthand. Dogs like Stephen possess sensory abilities that far exceed human capabilities, and their protective behavior should be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Christina often reflected on the lessons Stephen had taught her family. The experience had humbled her, showing her how much she didn't know about the world around her and how valuable it was to pay attention to sources of information she had previously overlooked. Stephen had been trying to communicate vital information for weeks, and her failure to listen had nearly resulted in tragedy. The renovated room became a symbol of second chances and renewed trust. Emma's new bedroom was beautiful, but more importantly, it was safe. The experience had taught the entire family to appreciate the visible and invisible protections that surrounded them. From the obvious safety measures they could see and understand to the subtle guardianship provided by a dog whose senses could detect dangers that remained hidden from human perception. Jerry's work productivity actually improved after the incident, as he learned to appreciate the sounds of Stephen's movements as indicators of safety rather than sources of distraction. The rhythmic clicking of Stephen's nails on the hardwood floor became a comforting reminder that their family's guardian was on duty, alert and attentive to any threats that might emerge. The financial cost of treating the centipede infestation and renovating Emma's room had been significant, but Christina and Jerry considered it a small price to pay for their daughter's safety and their dog's vindication. They had learned that the most valuable protections often come from unexpected sources, and that dismissing warnings because they don't fit our preconceptions can have devastating consequences. Local veterinarians began referring to the Peterson case when counseling other pet owners about changes in animal behavior. Sandra Myers used Stephen's story to illustrate the importance of investigating rather than immediately trying to correct protective behavior in family pets. The case became a teaching tool for helping people understand that animals often perceive threats that humans miss entirely. The anniversary of Stephen's heroic actions became an annual celebration in the Peterson household. Each year, Christina and Jerry would reflect on how different their lives might have been if they had followed through on their plan to rehome Stephen, and each year they felt renewed gratitude for the dog's persistent protection of Emma. The anniversary served as a reminder to pay attention to the subtle communications and warnings that surrounded them daily. Stephen, now recognized as a local hero, seemed to carry himself with quiet dignity. He had returned to his normal weight and energy level, but his protective instincts remained as sharp as ever. Christina and Jerry learned to read his behavior as valuable intelligence about their family's safety and well-being. They had discovered that living with Stephen meant having access to sensory information that could detect threats long before they became visible to human perception. Emma, now 4 years old, had no memory of the danger she had faced, but she understood that Stephen was special. She would often tell people that Stephen was her protector, and her absolute trust in him reflected the deep bond that had been forged during those dangerous weeks when he had been her only guardian against unseen threats. Their relationship had become a testament to the power of interspecies communication and protection. The story continued to resonate with people far beyond their local community. Christina received letters from families around the world who had experienced similar situations where their pets had tried to warn them about hidden dangers. The common thread in all these stories was the initial dismissal of the animal's behavior as problematic, followed by the devastating realization that the pet had been trying to save lives. Christina and Jerry began speaking at animal welfare events and pet owner education seminars, sharing Stephen's story as an example of the importance of understanding and respecting animal behavior. They emphasized that pets often serve as early warning systems for dangers that human senses cannot detect, and that changes in animal behavior should be investigated rather than automatically corrected. The pest control company that had treated their home began including information about pet behavior in their customer education materials. Lewis Stewart often told clients that family pets could be their best allies in detecting pest problems before they became serious infestations. He credited Stephen with teaching him to pay attention to animal behavior as a diagnostic tool in his professional work. Stephen's story became part of the curriculum at the local veterinary school, where students learned about the sensory capabilities of domestic animals and their role in protecting human families. Sandra Myers, who had treated Stephen throughout his ordeal, used the case to teach future veterinarians about the stress that protective animals experience when their warnings are dismissed or misunderstood. The experience had taught Christina and Jerry that heroism often comes in forms that aren't immediately recognizable. Stephen's pacing, whining, and protective positioning had seemed like behavioral problems, but they had actually been the actions of a hero who was sacrificing his own comfort to protect a vulnerable child. The lesson extended beyond their relationship with Stephen to their understanding of protection and communication in all its forms. Emma's room, with its new walls and fresh paint, stood as a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of listening to warnings that come from unexpected sources. The room was beautiful, but more importantly, it was safe. The experience had taught the entire family to appreciate both the visible and invisible protections that surrounded them daily. The local news station continued to follow up on Stephen's story, featuring annual updates that showed how the family had grown and changed since the centipede incident. The ongoing coverage helped spread awareness about the importance of paying attention to changes in pet behavior and investigating rather than dismissing animal warnings about potential dangers. As Emma grew older, she began to understand more fully what Stephen had done for her. Christina would tell her the story of how Stephen had protected her from dangerous creatures she couldn't see, and Emma would wrap her arms around Stephen's neck with a gratitude that seemed to go beyond her years. The story became part of Emma's understanding of love and protection, teaching her that care sometimes comes in forms that aren't immediately obvious. The bond between Stephen and Emma continued to deepen as she grew. Emma would often be found lying beside Stephen, reading him stories or sharing her thoughts about her day. Stephen would listen with the patient attention that had characterized his protection of her. His presence, a constant reminder of the invisible guardianship that surrounded her daily life. Christina found herself becoming more attuned to subtle signals and warnings in all areas of her life. The experience with Stephen had taught her that important information often comes from sources that seem unlikely or inconvenient. She learned to pause and investigate when something felt wrong, rather than automatically dismissing concerns that didn't fit her expectations. Jerry's relationship with Stephen had evolved into deep respect and partnership. He began including Stephen in more family activities, recognizing that the dog's instincts and senses provided valuable information about their environment. Jerry learned to read Stephen's body language and behavior as a form of communication that could alert them to potential problems before they became serious threats. The veterinary community continued to reference Stephen's case when discussing the sensory capabilities of domestic dogs and their role in protecting human families. Research inspired by Stephen's story had led to better understanding of how dogs detect chemical signatures associated with pests, structural problems, and other hidden dangers that pose threats to household safety. Christina and Jerry became advocates for animal welfare and responsible pet ownership, using Stephen's story to illustrate the importance of understanding and respecting animal behavior. They emphasize that pets are often trying to communicate important information and that dismissing their behavior as problematic without investigation can have serious consequences. The experience had taught them that protection comes in many forms, some of which aren't immediately recognizable or convenient. Stephen's heroic behavior had seemed like a problem that needed to be solved, but it had actually been a solution to a problem they didn't know they had. The lesson extended beyond their relationship with pets to their understanding of warnings and protection in all aspects of life. Emma's safety had been maintained by a guardian whose warnings had almost been dismissed as behavioral problems. The near miss had taught the entire family about the importance of listening to sources of information they might not immediately understand, and about the value of investigating concerns rather than automatically trying to eliminate them. Stephen's story became a reminder that heroism often requires persistence in the face of misunderstanding. For weeks, Stephen had continued his protective behavior despite negative responses from his human family. His dedication to Emma's safety had never wavered, even when his warnings were met with frustration and plans for his removal from the home. The local community continued to celebrate Stephen as a hero, but Christina and Jerry understood that his heroism lay not just in detecting the centipede threat, but in his unwavering commitment to Emma's protection despite being misunderstood. Stephen had taught them about loyalty, persistence, and the courage required to continue protecting others, even when that protection is not recognized or appreciated. Sometimes the most profound truths come to us through the persistence of those who cannot speak our language, but refuse to stop trying to save our lives. Stephen's story illuminates the invisible threads of protection that surround us daily, woven by creatures whose senses detect dangers we cannot perceive, and whose love transcends the barriers of species and communication. In a world where we often dismiss what we don't immediately understand, Stephen's heroism reminds us that wisdom sometimes comes on four legs, with scratched paws and exhausted eyes, carrying warnings that sound like problems until we finally learn to listen. The bond between humans and animals exists in a space beyond words, where instinct speaks to instinct and love recognizes love, regardless of the form it takes. Stephen's weeks of vigilant protection, his refusal to abandon his post despite misunderstanding and frustration, his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for Emma's safety, represent the purest form of devotion. He had no way to explain the chemical signatures he detected, no means to describe the creatures lurking in the walls, no vocabulary to articulate the urgency of his warnings. All he could do was position his body between danger and the child he loved, and trust that eventually his human family would understand. Christina and Jerry's journey from frustration to gratitude illustrates how easily we can mistake protection for problems when we fail to recognize the forms that love can take. Their near decision to rehome Stephen serves as a sobering reminder that our limited perception can lead us to reject the very guardianship that keeps us safe. Stephen's story challenges us to look beyond our immediate understanding, to investigate rather than dismiss, and to trust that those who love us may perceive threats that remain invisible to our senses. The experience transformed not just the Peterson family's relationship with Stephen, but their understanding of protection, communication, and trust in all its forms. They learned that safety often depends on guardians whose methods we don't recognize, whose warnings we don't understand, and whose sacrifice we don't immediately appreciate. Stephen's heroism lay not just in detecting the centipede threat, but in his unwavering commitment to Emma's protection, despite weeks of misunderstanding and negative response from his human family. Emma's unconscious trust in Stephen during those dangerous weeks, her instinctive comfort in his presence, even when her parents were frustrated with his behavior, reflects the deep wisdom that exists beyond conscious understanding. Children and animals often communicate on levels that bypass adult logic and skepticism, recognizing protection and love in their purest forms. Emma's bond with Stephen represents the kind of trust that exists before doubt, the recognition of safety that doesn't require explanations or justification. The story resonates because it reminds us that heroism rarely announces itself clearly. Stephen's protective behavior looked like obsession, his warning sounded like whining, his vigilance appeared to be anxiety. True protection often comes disguised as inconvenience, and the greatest dangers are frequently the ones we cannot see. Stephen's persistence in the face of dismissal and frustration exemplifies the kind of love that continues to protect even when that protection is not recognized or appreciated. If this story opened your eyes to the incredible intuition and protective instincts of our animal companions, we want to hear from you. Share this video with everyone who loves animals, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of animal heroism and the unbreakable bonds between pets and their families. Your own incredible pet story could be the next one we feature, so tell us in the comments about the amazing animals in your life who have shown you what unconditional love and protection really mean.